pleasure without God. God has given us many things to enjoy on this earth, but our priority should be to live in God's will and focus on eternal values. Here now is Gene Getz.
When Solomon became king, he made a humble request. He said, Lord, I can't judge these people. I need wisdom. I can't do it. And he's not asking for honor or riches or victory over his enemies, and God was pleased with that. And so God gave him wisdom. Wisdom at that time in any man was greater, none greater than Solomon. But Solomon, as you know, made some very, very bad choices and walked away from the will of God. And that led to some very disastrous experiences and conclusions about life. You see, when God gave him that wisdom, and when God gave him riches, when God gave him honor, he also gave him a free will. A free will to make choices. And he succeeded in asking and engaging in a lot of events that were out of the will of God. He proceeded to find fulfillment in all that he had. And it's very interesting because he purposely made a decision. And notice what that decision was. You see this here in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 3. I've called this Solomon's experiment with pleasure. I explored with my mind how to let my body enjoy life with wine and how to grasp folly. My mind still guiding me with wisdom until I could see what is good for people to do under heaven during the few days of their life or their lives. In other words, he made a choice with his mind to allow his body to engage in every pleasure he could think of, every experience, so that he could advise other people on how to find meaning in life. Now that's really, really a sad commentary on a man with that kind of wisdom, that kind of success in life. And so as you go on in this chapter, he just outlines everything. He begins, of course, here with wine. And a lot of people will engage in that kind of experience. You know, we could translate that into our culture today with marijuana and drugs of various kinds to be able to explore life and what is there in life and the pleasures of life, and that led him into a lot of trouble. Going on into verse 4, he said, I built houses, incomparable buildings. And he did. He said, I planted vineyards, and they were very successful. By the way, that's where he got a lot of his wine, right out of those vineyards. He also said, I planted gardens, I established parks that were a wonder for the eye to see. I had servants. I had many servants. I had servants of servants. He goes on in verse 7 to say, I had cattle, I had flocks. No one compared, really, with all that he had. See, God said he was going to give him riches. Well, he did. But he used them to be able to experiment with pleasure. Silver and gold. Magnificent. He also said music. And that's very significant. He said, I had choirs and I had singers and I had music to bring me pleasure. And then he said, in essence, I had all that I could experience when it came to sensuality. And by the way, that was one of his major, major downfalls because of his multiplication of wives and concubines. And we read very clearly in Scripture that these pagan women turned his heart and mind away from God. And so he had all of these incredible, pleasurable experiences, but here's his conclusion. And again, it's another sad conclusion that's very much focused on this earth and on pleasure. He said this, all that my eyes desired I did not deny them. I did not refuse myself any pleasure, for I took pleasure in all my struggles. In other words, he's also saying that when I had problems, when I was depressed, when I was down, what I tried to do was to medicate myself, if we don't use language today, with wine and women and song. This was my reward for all my struggles, he said. When I considered all that I had accomplished and what I had labored to achieve, I found everything to be futile and a pursuit of the wind. There was nothing to be gained under the sun. Wow. What a tragedy. The question is, why did God inspire Solomon to record this sad commentary on his choices in life? And as I thought about that, I thought about Paul's words when he wrote to the Corinthians. When he said this, "Now these things happened to them as examples." And he's referring there to Old Testament leaders. Particularly, he's referring to the wilderness experience with the children of Israel when they worshiped the golden calf. But certainly it applies to all the other things, including Solomon's life. These things happened to them as examples, and they were written as a warning to us, on whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore, whoever thinks he stands must be careful not to fall. Why is this book written? It's a lesson to all of us. As I was thinking about that, I also thought of another story, a life story, because God uses life stories in the Old Testament to teach us dynamic lessons. And what we have here in Ecclesiastes, I believe, is the life story of a man who did not end well. He started well, but he didn't end well. There was another man just like that. And when we were looking at the book of Judges, we saw this as a life story. And in the book of Judges, what you have is that after the death of Joshua, the children of Israel began to worship the Baals. They didn't teach their children. They began to follow after false gods. And they went into chaos. And they were taken over by their enemies. And then, in the midst of all their despair, they would cry out to God, and God would have mercy on them because He had made a promise to them, and He wasn't going to violate it. When they cried out to Him, they had judges that emerged. The judges weren't necessarily spiritual men, or there was Deborah as well, and she wasn't necessarily a spiritual woman. But they were able to guide the children of Israel out of the bondage that they were in. And so for a period of time, after they would clean up their act a bit, they would again go down. So the book of Judges is a spiral of coming out, going down, coming out, going down, and all going down. And there's a whole series of judges. They were all really ungodly people, but God blessed them anyway. Even Gideon. We often talk about Gideon, but Gideon had horrible flaws in his life. And he didn't end well either. But at the end of Judges, we have the record of the last judge. His name was Samson. And it's really fascinating that what we see here, I think, is a life story that illustrates Israel. And in the Life Essential Study Bible, I outline these basically for you, but let me just show you how Samson's life illustrates the children of Israel and why I think God chose to record it in detail here at the end of the book of Judges. Namely, that the children of Israel can look at Samson's life and see themselves. So here, notice these comparisons. God chose Samson to deliver Israel from the Philistines before they called out for deliverance. Before they ever called out. That's unusual in the book of Judges, because usually He would answer their prayer if they called out. But look at Israel. God chose Israel to be His people when no one was seeking God. Started with Abraham. From Abraham came the chosen people. Samson illustrates what God did for Israel. But notice what happened. God called Samson to live a life of separation and devotion. And God called Israel to be a nation devoted to his righteousness. What happened next? In spite of God's elective grace, Samson turned out to be a rash, opportunistic, and immature man. He made horrible, horrible decisions. Decisions involved immorality and idolatry. And notice Israel. In spite of God's elective grace, Israel took advantage of God's love and mercy and did evil in his sight again and again and again. Samson illustrates that. Going on, in contrast, Samson violated God's will by being drawn to pagan women. How could he? But he did. Israel, again and again, committed spiritual adultery by worshiping pagan gods and actually engaging in sexual immorality, which was a part of that. But throughout Israel's existence, God accused them of spiritual adultery. Samson illustrated that. As a result of his sins, Samson was in bondage and oppressed by the Philistines. Remember, his eyes were put out and his secret of strength was discovered, and he was in bondage of the Philistines, oppressed. But as a result of their sins, Israel was in bondage to their enemies again and again throughout the book of Judges. You see how Samson illustrates Israel. Here's another contrast. Samson cried out to God in the midst of his oppression, just like the children of Israel. Again and again, Israel cried out to God when they were oppressed. Samson illustrated that. And what happened? God heard Samson's plea, gave him strength to destroy his enemies as he was chained to those pillars. And God gave him the strength in his blindness to push those pillars out, came down and destroyed his enemies. And again, what do we see in Israel? God heard Israel's plea and often delivered them from their enemies. So Samson is a beautiful illustration, if we want to use the word beautiful. Maybe we could say a very graphic illustration of what happened to Israel. So here's the principle that I came up with back when we studied Judges. In this story, I called it stories that teach. When we read biblical stories of people's lives, we should look for the lessons we can learn from both their successes and their failure. And I believe that this principle also comes from the life of Solomon as he records the book of Ecclesiastes. And this is why God has given us a very detailed expose of a man who had everything in this life but made very, very bad choices. So we have the principle, pleasure without God. And God has given us many things to enjoy on this earth, but our priority should be to live in God's will and focus on eternal values. And that's something that Solomon didn't do. So it's a great lesson. And so the question is, why is it so difficult to enjoy all the blessings of this life and at the same time keep our focus on God's eternal values? Well, again, it's our natural tendency. It's our natural tendency to focus on the good things in our lives that God has given us and to forget why God has called us to reflect his glorious plan of salvation. You know, we just tend to forget God. In the midst of comfort, our tendency is to forget God. And we see that historically. And so the Scriptures are warning us to be able to honor God, to enjoy the good things God has given us. God doesn't want us not to enjoy these good gifts, but he wants us to remember where they came from. And that in themselves, we will not find fulfillment. And certainly, we see this here in the life of a man who wrote Ecclesiastes.